But welcome. Thank you for joining us today. As I said, it is a great day of celebration, as most of you know, if you're on this call. We had an awesome victory yesterday from the Department of Interior and Biden administration, and we're here to talk about it. And talk about what this means. And so we're happy to have everyone here. Before we get started, I want to introduce my colleague, Tom Donahoe. Tom is a Friends of the Boundary Waters board member, the chair of our policy committee, and just an all-around environmental expert as far as my money is concerned. So Tom, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I am, like everyone else on this call, this webinar, really excited about what happened in the last 24 hours.
Absolutely. And before we get started, I would just encourage, if you have a question while we're talking or something comes up, just put it in the Q&A. Yep, and Tom, thank you for doing that. We'll definitely get to that. Yes, that's certainly a good question. So yeah, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A. I'd also encourage anybody to just say, how you're feeling in the chat. We don't always get big victories like this. And so I know that we're all feeling pretty uplifted today. And so, please feel free to share those thoughts and feelings in the chat here before we get started, or as we get started, or as we go along, because I know like you, I'm certainly very excited today. So let's go ahead and get started. So Tom, can you see this here?
Sure can. Yep.
All right. Let's go ahead and get started. So yes, what happened yesterday? Federal moratorium on copper sulfide mining. Huge victory. As many people will remember, this is something that has been essentially in consideration and going back and forth for the last couple of years. But essentially what it means is the 225,000 acres in the Rainy River watershed, which is the watershed for the eastern portion of the Boundary Waters, will no longer allow any copper sulfide, nickel, any type of heavy metal, non-ferrous mining on federal land in this area, which is directly adjacent to the Boundary Waters in the watershed. Now, one of the reasons this was so dangerous, obviously, as we all know, water flows, right? We hear a lot of people say, oh, okay, why can't we do this here? It's not in the Boundary Waters. What's the problem? Well, problem is water flows. It doesn't listen to our lines on the map, right? And so that's why this was so important, because all of this area, whatever happens here, it flows into the Boundary Waters and affects the Boundary Waters. So we're super excited about this. The background here is really long, but we'll try to give you the condensed version. Essentially, there was a different mining company that was originally granted leases in 1966 to do mining in this area. Now, this was before the Boundary Waters was established. This was before Twin Metals certainly was a company. And so it was a long time ago when we were governed by different laws. These leases were renewed in 1989 and 2004. They never actually began construction of a project, which was one of the terms of the leases. And so in 2012, a company called Twin Metals, which is a shell corporation for the mining giant Antofagasta, based out of Chile, they bought these leases and applied for a renewal in 2012. However, in 2016, what happened was the Forest Service and the Department of the Interior studied this and looked at this and decided this is too dangerous to the Boundary Waters, and we're going to cancel these mining leases, and they were allowed to expire. Now, the next step of that is something I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Tom Donahoe to talk about.
Sure. So this is really important context. I already see a couple of questions about, can this be overturned by executive question? We got to kind of talk about where we've been, because it's going to be part of the answer. The short story, and I might fly through a few of these slides, but the short story is, at the conclusion of the Obama administration, you had the leases being denied, and then you also had the beginnings of a process of this withdrawal process that we've just seen come to a conclusion. But this was, weeks, a few months before the Trump administration came into power. And so once the Trump administration came through, you had an obviously different perspective on mining in the Boundary Waters. Because there was the renewal of the leases, came under the purview of the solicitor of the Interior Department under the BLM. You had the deputy solicitor reinterpreting the twin metal leases. So if you think of the end of the Obama administration, there's really two things. One is not renewing the leases, and two is looking into a withdrawal and beginning the process of doing an environmental study on the potential withdrawal. We're talking about the first of those, which is the leases themselves. So this was the easiest thing to basically reverse for the Trump administration. They just had the deputy solicitor come in and issue a separate opinion. And so that opinion overturned the previous opinion, and the leases were back on the table. So that's what happened in 2016. In 2018, you had the actual process of renewing the leases come to a conclusion at the end of 2018 into 2019. And these leases precluded BLM's ability to completely stop mining through what's called no surface occupancy stipulation. This is getting into some technical range, but basically it was a green light for the Twin Metals leases. So that's 2018, 2019. Scott, if you go to the next slide. Obviously, this was something that was met with a lot of resistance from Friends of the Boundary Waters and other partners in the area, and including national organizations. And so this led to some lawsuits. And the basis for those lawsuits was that the change in position from the Trump administration was what's called arbitrary and capricious. So in legal terms, the legal standard for action by a administration's department such as the BLM or the Department of Interior is that there has to be, without getting too far into the law, you have to have a well-considered basis for taking an action. You can't do what's arbitrary and capricious, especially if there's previous action, whether it's by your administration or previous administration, previous action by the federal government. You can't come in without a reasonable basis and change what has already been done. And so this is an area of administrative law that gets kind of arcane, but that was the basis for a lot of the lawsuits that came down the pipe. So if we can go to the next slide.
All right.
Now, the arbitrary and capricious standard, and this is where I'm going to sort of fly through some slides here, because I don't know that a lot of you want to get into the black and white, the X's and O's of the legalities of NEPA and some other bases for challenging the leases. But what we argued at Friends and what other entities and nonprofit organizations that were aligned with us argued was that the National Environmental Policy Act, if you apply the arbitrary and capricious standard to the tenets of that act, that the government acted arbitrarily and capriciously and didn't do what they were supposed to do and what was required in the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, to take the action that they did to renew those leases. So that's the legal basis. We had a lot of partners in this. It wasn't just Friends, but obviously we were doing a lot of fighting in the courts throughout the legal systems, through appeals and otherwise, to fight against these leases. So we challenged the new interpretation and the reinstatement in the District of Columbia, District Court in the District of Columbia. And that case is still technically pending right now, but obviously what happened yesterday makes a lot of the issues, potentially makes a lot of the issues moot. Obviously we're going to, we have lawyers who are going to take a look at that, but this is great news. And if those leases are essentially worthless because they can't be engaging in the conduct that they want to be engaging in the boundary waters, then this is great news for everybody. So we go to the next slide. And we can just skip this one. I talked a little bit about violation of NEPA and the fact that they didn't do what they were supposed to do from a procedural standpoint. They didn't get an environmental impact statement, which was required. And so we had essentially an argument that, and you can go to the next one too, Scott, that these guys were playing fast and loose with the administrative process, and they were doing it just to open up the boundary waters for mining as quickly as possible. So that takes us to pretty close to where we are today. it takes us to the Biden administration, at least. If you can go to the next slide. Now, remember, I said that there were two elements here. The first is the leases, and the second is the withdrawal process. When the Biden administration came in, instead of waiting till sort of seventh year and 300 days to begin the process of doing what we were just challenging in the courts, and right, the environmental impact statement, before beginning the process of going through, beginning the administrative process of examining an action by the Department of the Interior, by the BLM, at the end of the administration, the Biden administration got going right away and started exploring the possibility of a 20-year ban. So that would make the leases, whether they were valid leases or not under the law, that would make them effectively worthless if there was a ban on copper sulfide mining on the federal land that those leases covered. So that process began pretty soon after the Biden administration took over. It's a lengthy process. It calls for comments from the public. A lot of you probably were involved in that or may have been invited to be involved in that. Anybody can provide comments. Friends of the Boundary Waters definitely provided comments, and we're trying to rally as much support as possible in support of this. And that leads us up to this year and really yesterday, which is lease or no lease, there's now a ban on copper sulfide mining on federal land. Go to the next slide.
Yep. And so Tom, thank you for explaining that better than my non-legal mind certainly can. And so essentially we're just grateful today. As Tom mentioned, last January on permit day, the Biden administration canceled the Twin Metals leases. And then today, this year, the day after permit day, they announced this moratorium. And so we're really grateful for that. Can't get much better. I did see someone in the chat mention that they're not convinced this fight is over, and that's exactly right. The fight is not over. As we know, we here at the Friends say 2 mines, 1 threat, 2 watersheds, 1 threat, right? The Rainy River watershed, which is being protected by this action, is super important, obviously. But there's also the Lake Superior watershed that we're concerned about. As many people have known, there's another mine called Polymet, which is upstream of Lake Superior. Lake Superior is home to 10% of the world's fresh water. We here at the Friends of Boundary Waters are concerned with protecting all the Superior National Forest and its surrounding ecosystem. And so we want to make sure that while we celebrate today, which we most definitely need to do, and thank Secretary Holland and President Biden and all the scientists that worked on this, we also know that this is just one step. We have to continue working, and that's why Friends of the Boundary Waters is working at the state legislature to pass a bill called Prove It First. Now, many people will have heard of this. Prove It First is simply a bill that would require independent scientific proof that one of these mines is operated for 20 years without polluting. This was a law in Wisconsin for 20 years. It had to be repealed by Governor Scott Walker because he wanted to try to pass a mine. During those 20 years, no mines were permitted of this kind. And so we don't think that if there's no proof that this can be done safely, we shouldn't be doing it next to our cleanest water in the Boundary Waters in Lake Superior. So we'll continue to fight for that. Stay tuned for a webinar in a couple of weeks talking more about the state legislature. And then we're also working, as some people may have heard, we're in the very early stages of analyzing the threat from a mine called Tech. Tech is a mine that is proposed to essentially merge with Polymet and make a mega polluter mine that's over twice the size. It's especially scary because it would be both in the Lake Superior watershed and in the Rainy River watershed on state land. Therefore, this decision does not affect that. So, Twin Metals has been well and defeated, and if they try to come back, we'll obviously be there to challenge that. And we're very happy, and we need to celebrate that. We also know, as our friend in the chat mentioned, the fight goes on. And so we'll continue to do that. And as long as this fight is here, the Friends of the Boundary Waters will be here. So that's that. And I want to give everyone a chance to ask some questions. But first, we'll start with 2 questions from Howard and Tom. Essentially, can this order be turned by executive order? Or, if a president like President Trump that was in support of this mine came in 4 years or 8 years, could they overturn this, Tom?
The answer is yes, but. So remember I said earlier that the Obama administration sort of just began the process of doing an environmental impact statement, taking public comment, and doing these administrative prerequisites to taking agency action, but didn't get to conclude it before the Trump administration came in. Well, that was done this time with under the Biden administration, and that was all precursor to what we saw yesterday. So if a subsequent administration comes in and wants to reverse the ban, they can, but they're going to now need to go through a similar process. They need to basically find a way to subvert the science that was relied upon by the Biden administration, to find that the Biden administration in some way acted improperly. It didn't rely on proper science. And they would have to jump through some administrative hoops to do that. So this action by the Biden administration is really helpful because it basically sets a higher bar than Trump had to jump over just to reverse the leases and to cancel the study on a ban, which he did in short order. So it can be overturned. It absolutely can be, but we now have an opportunity, if that were to occur, to fight a little bit harder. We'd have greater legal bases to challenge that kind of action, just as we did before. And also, I should point out that any kind of action with respect to the boundary waters, whether it's from an administration, executive order, all the way down to legislative, can eventually be overturned. There's always going to be a mechanism, which is why it's really important what Scott said. The Prove It First bill and finding a way to take legislative action. It's way harder to reverse legislative action, just if you're thinking about political realities, than for one president to come in and decide he wants to do something different. And so, in my mind, what this does is, at Friends, we play a lot of defense. Right? What we're trying to do is protect. We're playing defense all the time. We have this rare and awesome opportunity now to play a little bit of offense, to go out and to preserve the boundary waters through legislative action. And it's so rare for an organization like Friends, any conservation organization, to get to play offense and to go out and try and do something proactive that protects an area that isn't currently under dire threat. And so this gives us breathing room, and it also gives us a really important and rare opportunity to play offense. So yes, this action can be overturned by a subsequent administration. And if you have been following, the fate of the boundary waters for the last couple of decades, you know that it probably will happen. Somebody will come in and try to take this away. And so we need to act as quickly as possible, play a little offense, and get the Prove It First bill passed.
Absolutely. Well said, Tom. And, I think somebody said this in the chat, but one quote that we like to fall back on here at Friends of the Boundary Waters is by late great Walter Mondale, who said, all environmental victories are temporary and all losses are permanent. Right. And so, even if we get laws passed, there's really no such thing as permanent protection. Totally. The best we can do is laws, obviously, but we always need people like yourselves to be fighting and paying attention and making sure that we're protecting this very special place. So thanks so much for being here. I see one question that we have here is, this is so great. How may this trickle out to other important watersheds facing this type of mining? Great question. So as I mentioned, there is the St. Louis River Lake Superior watershed, which is under threat from polymet. There's also, we don't work in this area, but our fellow environmental groups are working on a mine in Tamarack, Minnesota, that you may have heard, called Talon, which has signed a preliminary agreement from Tesla. And so you may have heard a lot about that. We're also very concerned about that, right? And so I think what this does as well, it doesn't actually take away any of those areas from being mined. It certainly strengthens our argument and gives us more scientific evidence to say, like, look, this is the wrong place for this. Northeastern Minnesota is the wrong place for this. Next to our clean water is the wrong place for this. And that really gives us a lot of standing to say that, now that the federal government has also said that, because it's hard to say, okay, well, let's protect the boundary waters, but not Lake Superior, right? And so it really gives us a stronger area to go from that. And so we're really happy about that. Additionally, I will put on everyone's radar The issue with polymet and why that can't be acted on by the federal government like this is because it's on state land. State has jurisdiction over it. However, there is one federal permit. There is one federal permit that does need to be issued by the Biden administration and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Without getting too much into the details, that permit was supposed to be ruled on by the EPA, who was supposed to say, okay, this is either going to be safe for downstream communities or not. And the EPA actually acted on behalf of Native communities, the Fond du Lac Band, who said that, and the EPA found that this would polymet would very likely pollute downstream water. And they don't recommend reissuing the permit, which means that essentially the Biden administration could act to stop that permit, and we're hopeful that they will follow the science and do so. So those are kind of the ways that I see it trickling down. But anything you want to add there, Tom?
No, I think I just wanted to point out one thing, which is, you said not northeastern Minnesota. One line of argument that you hear a lot recently about mining in near the boundary waters and in Minnesota generally is, well, these are precious metals that we need to support the growing, the growing energy industry that doesn't rely on fossil fuels. And sometimes people try and point that out as some kind of there's a binary choice. That's not what this is, right? This is the federal government, and I can point directly to statements by the Biden administration. They absolutely want to do everything they can to create, a domestic pipeline of precious metals necessary for specific areas of the energy industry, but they're not willing to do it, and we're not willing for them to do it in an area that is going to result in massive pollution through waterways, which is the boundary waters. So there very well may be, and I know that there are places throughout the United States where the federal government, private parties can get to these kinds of metals that they're looking for, and they can do that without polluting one of the most important areas of the entire lower 48, right? And so it's not, when you hear that argument, the very easy retort is, absolutely we should be supporting that industry, and solar is an important part of our our energy future and things like that, but we don't need it to be at the cost of one of the gems of the United States in the boundary waters. And that's what the Biden administration has said with this order, and that's what advocates for this kind of ban have been saying all along.
Absolutely. Yeah, well said, Tom. And I think that that's what's key, right? Is it's not always about what you do, it's about where you do it too. And so making sure that we're not polluting our cleanest water, especially as we know, if climate change continues to get worse, clean water is going to be our most precious resource, not any heavy metal. And so we need to make sure that we're protecting that above all else. And so, yeah, absolutely. Another question we have here is, how do we get a cumulative impact analysis of mining known mineral deposits, and basically how do we get environmental impact analysis for the whole Duluth complex? That's a great question, Libby. I'm not 100% sure that I know the answer to that, but Tom, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so what this is one of the, you said what's next. People have been asking what's next. So what's next in terms of offense and what's next in terms of defense? This is a what's next in terms of defense. We have Teck tapping into a large complex for metals and trying to create a super polluter mine. And the question is, how do we get to a point where we can point to the cumulative environmental impact? And that is something that Friends is doing right now. We are trying to do everything we can. We're writing letters to legislators. We are advocating, boots on the ground stuff to try and get some accountability from the Department of Natural Resources to legislators and from the actual entities themselves, from Teck itself, to show that this is not going to be a massive disaster. And there are a couple ways that we can do that. We're looking at everything from combination agreements to statutory regulations, and trying to push as many buttons as possible so that we can get a environmental review that is comprehensive in nature and actually takes into account the full scope of any kind of supermine that may be coming in into existence in the future. So that's one of the areas where we're continuing to play, defense and to preserve and try and stand as that last line. But I see another question is, and quite a few is, what's next in terms of offense? And it's a great question. And Scott touched on it initially, but again, just to emphasize, we're so rarely in this position where we can gather resource and put it towards doing something that has real lasting impact for the boundary waters. Prove it first is the top of the list, right? That is something where if we get that passed, if we have enough support for it in the legislature, then we could end up with a law in the books that says there can be no mining near the boundary waters unless it's through a proven method, a method that's proven not to pollute. And you know what is not proven? Copper sulfide mining of the type that was been proposed by mining entities coming into Minnesota. So that's number one on the list. But we're taking a number of other steps too. That's not the only bill that we're advocating for at Friends of the Boundary Waters. We're trying to, protect the taxpayers' money by making sure that if a mining company comes in, that they have sufficient, even if they're allowed to mine, that they have sufficient sufficient money behind the project, so that if anything ever went wrong, it wouldn't be a problem for the taxpayers of the state of Minnesota. It wouldn't be a problem for the state of Minnesota government. It would be a problem for the mining company, and that's something that would make them think twice about coming into the state and looking at a potential pollution project. So those are two items. There's quite a few items that I think you guys will hear about in the near future that we're attacking.
Yep, absolutely. And just a couple questions following up on that Prove It First bill. That is being introduced by Senator Jen McEwen. Senator McEwen is a state senator from Duluth. And we are also looking at introducing that with a House author who has yet to, we're saving that. So stay tuned. That'll be revealed very soon. We do have a House author, but we're going to be revealing that very soon. So yeah, so keep in mind, we will be introducing all these bills in the upcoming weeks in the Minnesota legislature. Stay tuned on Friends social media, our newsletter, because we'll have really easy take action links for you. One other thing that I do want to highlight while we're on this topic of state bills and things like that, what to do next. Someone in the chat had mentioned, the problem with Minnesota DNR and regulating these mines. Now, what many people don't realize is that our Department of Natural Resources, while they do have a mission and an obligation to protect our natural resources, they also have an obligation to promote mining. And that's kind of a relic of a bygone age, we feel. But we also feel like it leads to a conflict of interest in between, should they permit these projects or not, right? Because if they know it's going to be environmentally harmful, but they also have a mission to promote mining, well, what are they supposed to do? Obviously, we feel like they should put environmental protections first, but let's get rid of that conflict of interest. And so we're actually going to have a bill that's already been dropped by legislator Senator Kelly Morrison, who's a great champion for this issue. She actually introduced a bill with Representative Sandra Feist to move that obligation to promote mining to the Department of Employment and Economic Development, DEED. Which means that DNR would be free to permit based on environmental protection, because DEED is not a permitting agency. And so that's actually something that we definitely think should happen. And so, yeah, whoever put that in the chat, you're spot on. And please, again, stay tuned. We'll have an opportunity to comment on that bill very soon. One thing that maybe I'll mention, and I'll give this one to you, Tom, just to get back to the moratorium for a second. Someone mentioned, why is Polymet and the western side of the BWCA not included in this moratorium?
So the moratorium, I think there's a couple of reasons why, and I can't give you a definitive answer because I'm not in the Biden administration. There's a couple of things here. First of all, this is a little bit of an outgrowth of some of you may be familiar with Betty McCollum's bill seeking protection. I think it's basically a boundary waters protection bill. And the scope of that bill is specific to a watershed and the primary watershed that flows into the boundary waters. And so there's some of that being just the political baseline from which the Biden administration is working off of. Some of it is also, let me put it as simply as possible, it's just map drawing, right? So you want to find a natural scope that is defensible, and that when you do an environmental impact statement, you can be sure that what you're proposing in the area that you're proposing, you'll get to where you want to be, which is this ban. And so I think there's some political reasons there as well. That's not to say that we think at Friends of the Boundary Waters that that's the only watershed that matters. We certainly don't. But those are some of the reasons why we got there. I just want to also add on one other thing on the offense part. So I'm looking down at this webinar. It says there's 107 participants in here, which is great. The reason why I'm on this call and why I think a lot of you are in this call is because at some point in life, you went to the Boundary Waters and you felt what it was like to be in the Boundary Waters. And whether it was a great time with your family, whether it was the peace of the Boundary Waters, a lot of you went as kids. And so one of my favorite things that Friends of the Boundary Waters does, that's not that I would consider offense, but it's really just about growing the community, is we send kids to the Boundary Waters. And so, the idea there is 5 years from now, 10 years from now, on a call like this, instead of seeing 100 and however many participants, you'll see 1,000 or 2,000. That the number of voices shouting out to protect the Boundary Waters grows. And so I think one of the most important things that we do, one of the most important places that my money as a donor goes to, is sending kids out of the Boundary Waters and evangelizing for what the Boundary Waters represents, which is really important. And so that's not maybe as sexy as filing a lawsuit or, getting a bill passed, but I think in the long term, it's potentially more important. And so I think I won't say it's the most important, but to me, it's definitely one of the most important ways in which we play offense and advocate for the Boundary Waters. We're creating, experiences and memories for people that will last for the rest of their life in the same way that it does for a lot of you. And it's a big reason why I'm guessing you guys are on this call and why you're following our fight and you're joining in the fight. And so that's another important place where donor dollars go every single day. And that's another way that we're working to protect the Boundary Waters, even if it's not, something that we can put up in flashing lights every month or so. So I just want everyone to keep that in mind.
Yeah, well said. We often say on our team, the best thing we can do to get new advocates for the Boundary Waters is to send a new person up there, right? Because I think 99 out of 100 people, when they go up for the first time afterwards, they're going to want to protect it. I know that was how it was for me, and I know that was for how many it is for so many of you. And so we're really grateful. And actually, on that note, I do want to take a minute to recognize Jerry Nelson, who's joining us today. Her husband, Darby Nelson, was one of the founders of the Friends of the Boundary Waters all the way back in the day. And like I said, we've been around since 1976. And so we couldn't do this work without our forefathers and foremothers, people like Jerry and Darby Nelson, people like Chuck Dayton and some Sig Olson and so many more, right? And so making sure that we thank those people, but continuing to build new advocates for future generations, because as we know, even if we get that permanent protection in the form of Betty McCollum's bill or Prove It First or whatever it may be, we still have to stay vigilant because people will be trying to take that away. And so making sure that we're all here and all helping, and that really means a lot. And so thank you for everybody for that. One thing I want to answer here is there's a question in the chat. What do you say to the Minnesota mining industry who are very concerned about the loss of jobs? And so, yeah, that's a great question. So there's a couple things I'll say, and then Tom, obviously feel free to add anything that you want. The first thing I'll say is that, as you noted in your chat, right, it's not a loss. It's just not a gain, right? There are no jobs in copper sulfide mining. There's never been a single person who worked in a copper sulfide mine in Minnesota, right? This has never been done. And so there's no jobs that are being lost. Additionally, we are actually trying to protect jobs. There's thousands of family sustaining jobs right now that depend on a clean wilderness. Harvard has even done an economic study about this, and they found that after a few years, there would be a slight boost from the mine originally, and then as soon as it starts to pollute and people find out about the mining industry in this area, we're going to lose all those jobs that are there now. And once the mine goes away, we're going to be out of luck. And so making sure that we emphasize, that we're protecting jobs. And then I think the other thing to say is that we want to move past this industry, but we also want to support economic development. As Tom mentioned, we don't just do advocacy here, we also do education. But the third pillar that we have besides education and advocacy is supporting thriving communities. And so, we've been up there supporting rural broadband. We've been trying to help with the Ely State Theater, number of other projects. We try to help with veterans on the lake camp. And so trying to find ways that we can support economic development in areas like this without polluting, right? Without polluting is the key part. And so making sure that we're, understanding where the other side is coming from, because, we can certainly understand wanting a job, wanting to be able to have your family stay in the area. But we just want to make sure that we're doing that in a way that isn't polluting. And so anything that we can do as the friends, and if anyone has any ideas, we're always open to that. So that's what I would say to someone is, let's work together, to protect the jobs that are there now and bring new jobs to the region that aren't polluting. I don't know if there's anything you want to add on that, Tom.
No, not really. Just, I guess the one thing I would add is consider for a second the rate at which we have disappearing wilderness and true wild in the United States in the lower 48. The Friends of the Boundary Waters is looking to protect the boundary waters because it's a special place. And a lot of people outside of Minnesota, I don't live in Minnesota. I used to live in Texas. I live in Colorado now, and I'm still involved every day in Friends of the Boundary Waters. A lot of people care about getting to a place of true wilderness, and that will become increasingly rare over the years. And so from just a dollars and cents standpoint, the value of ecotourism surrounding the boundary waters and around Superior Forest is going to go up as time goes on. And the availability of jobs, it's something that you don't have to think very hard to imagine where the boundary waters grows in estimation amongst people in the United States in the lower 48, simply because it's one of the rare places we have left that's truly wild. And so there's a real future there. And as Scott mentioned, mining's just a blip. And from a jobs perspective, it's a blip, and it doesn't sustain communities. It just has an infusion, and then everything floats away and communities shrivel up. And so mining's not the way to sustainable economic development for communities, especially around a special place like the Boundary Waters.
Absolutely. And you don't have to look much farther than some of the communities that were dependent on taconite mining, that are not anymore, and we see that all around the country, but also in Minnesota. So making sure that we do that. Howard asked, what can be done about Pete Stauber? Does Friends have a PAC targeted to effective representation for the BWCA? I can only touch on this briefly, Howard, because that is entering electoral territory. All I can say is that we certainly don't agree with Pete Stauber. Obviously, we do have a sister or affiliate organization, if you will, the Friends of the Boundary Waters Action Network, that does work on the political side, as well as a PAC, the BWCA PAC. So I'd encourage anyone to check that out, if you're interested in that type of work, or shoot me an email. I'll put my email in the chat in a moment here, and we could talk more about that. But yes, that's also a part of it. It is an all the above strategy. There's a great question here from Carly, but I kind of want to answer it last because I think it would be a good last question. But does anybody else, before we get to that one, does anybody else have any other questions? Feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A. All right. Well,
before you
go ahead, Tom.
Before you sort of sign off with the future events, I just want to give a little bit of a closing note here, closing statement, which is, I think it's natural when something like this happens to feel like, oh, I can breathe, right? This is wonderful. I can breathe. I can relax for a while. We're safe for a little bit. But I think everyone should take some time to enjoy this. I think everyone should take some time to feel that way for a little bit, but don't leave the fight, because there's so much that we need to do now that we have a moment to breathe and we can kind of press forward. If you think of this like a battle, someone's constantly coming at you and you rebuff them and you finally have a moment you can breathe. Well, now's our time to push forward. And so your involvement is going to be as important, if not more important, in the coming months and years than it has been in the past. Before, the lines for fighting off against these challenges was pretty clear, right? There was some lawsuits that needed to be funded and that people needed to support. There's some comments that need to be provided to administrations. Now we've moved into a grayer area where we're pushing for legislation, and that's a really, really hard battle to fight. We're trying to get more kids into the boundary waters. That's every single dollar counts there. And so, we need your time and your effort and everything you can give to the boundary waters in the coming months and years, now more than ever. And I know that sounds really hackneyed, but it's so true, because we can take this time to breathe and rest and really smile about what's happened. But now we have an opportunity for the first time in a long time to get something done and to do more than just breathe, right? To breathe for generations, to have it so that our kids can breathe the same air that we're breathing in the boundary waters. So I want everyone to really enjoy this, but don't feel like it's over. So that's the last thing I wanted to say, Scott. Thanks.
No, that's excellent, Tom. And I certainly can't say it better than that myself. Just to kind of close here, what's the best way to support Friends of the Boundary Waters? Prove it first, things like that. That's an amazing question. We've touched on some of it here. Next steps, can we pass Betty McCollum's Boundary Waters Protection Act at the federal level? Friends has been supporting that all the way. It will be difficult, obviously, for those who follow national politics, but keep trying. Keep reaching out to Tina Smith, to Amy Klobuchar, get them on board. Prove it first at the state level. Get in touch with me. We're going to be introducing that bill again. It has 68 legislative supporters, but we need more. We need a majority. So help us help us send messages to your legislators. Help us give them calls. Come to the Capitol with us. We have a thousand things. Join our Citizen Action Network. That's a group of our most dedicated supporters. My colleague Maggie Morin is our new outreach coordinator. Maggie, if you could put your email in the chat if you want to join our Citizen Action Network, where we will send you an email every week saying, hey, this is what we need you to do this week. Please join that. And then finally, go to the Boundary Waters. Go to the Boundary Waters. Get your permits. They're open now. Right, exactly. Take your friends. Take somebody who's never gone before. If they don't think they can, trust me. For those who know me, I was born and raised in St. Paul. I did not go to the wilderness all that much, and I was able to do it. And now I go every year, right? So if I can do it, you can do it. I promise. And if anyone who thinks they can't do it, they can definitely do it. And so take people up there. And then lastly, I do want to say, I'll share one last slide with you. We will be having some events in the upcoming days, and starting with today. We'd love to see anyone who's in the Twin Cities come out and celebrate with us at Black Stack Brewery today from 4 to 6 p.m. Black Stack is a great supporter of ours. We'll have some of our elected official friends there, and we'll just be enjoying this victory, because as all we know, there's a lot of work left. We also know that this is one of the most historic victories in the history of the Boundary Waters, and we want to celebrate it as such. And then the last thing I'll say is, send a message. Send a message to the, and I'll put the email in the chat here. You can go and you can thank. You can actually thank the Department of the Interior. This is the email to send it to. Please feel free, if you feel like you want to make sure that the Biden administration knows that this was well supported in Minnesota, send an email to them saying thank you. Because we, as much as we need to keep the pressure on the people that disagree with us, it's also important to make the people that agree with us feel heard and feel supported. And so making sure that we do that. And so that's all we have for today. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. My email is the same as Maggie's. It's scott@friendsbwca.org. Shoot me an email or give me a call anytime. I'd be happy to talk through all of this, what's next. And then sign up for our webinar next Wednesday. We're going to be having a webinar on Wednesday with the cast of there's a Dorothy Moulter play at the Minnesota History Theater starting next week. And we're going to have the director and the star of the show joining us for a webinar to talk about Dorothy Moulter, her time in the Boundary Waters, the show, and then obviously environmental protection. And so make sure to join us next Wednesday at noon. And I hope to see as many of you as possible tonight at Blackstack. Tom, I know you'll be celebrating from afar, and so we appreciate it. And everybody who can't join us today, please, do whatever you do to celebrate and enjoy this victory.
Yeah, and go guys. Don't feel, if you're an introvert like me, you're thinking, I don't want to go to a place where I don't know anybody and can't. Boundary Waters events are great because you can start any conversation with, hey, what's your favorite lake? And that will result in a 2-hour conversation. So, everyone always has a story about where they've been and a favorite place they've been, a portage that they hate. Boundary Waters events are super easy to meet new people. So you guys should go.
Absolutely. And now you know me. So if you could see me there, and I'm happy to talk about, and hear about anything that you have to say. So come up, say hi. Everyone on our team will be in 10 out of 10 good spirits today. So we hope to see you all and enjoy it. And thank you so much for joining us today. And most of all, thanks for your advocacy and your support. It really would be no Friends of the Boundary Waters without all of you. And there would be no victories like this without all of you. So we're thankful to you, to our native groups that are partners with us, that are defending their own treaty rights, and then the fellow environmental organizations that make up this team. So thank you so much for everybody, and have a great day and enjoy this weekend. We really appreciate you. Thank you, everyone.